Detective James Carter's final breath was a bitter realization. The people who had sought to silence him were not only targeting him, but were sending a warning to those closest to him, his wife, his children. He knew his death would shake the foundation of everything they had worked for, but it would also send a message of fear to anyone who dared to stand up against corruption. He had spent years digging into cases, pulling at the threads of lies and deceit, uncovering truth that powerful people wanted buried. Now it seemed those threads were being pulled back at him, unraveling the life he had fought so hard to protect. As the sirens wailed in the distance, the darkness of the night seemed to consume everything. Blood stained the interior of his car, but it was his words, etched with the remnants of his fading strength, that would echo the loudest. Not an accident. Emily Carter, only 10 years old, had no way of understanding the full gravity of what had just occurred. Her father had always been her hero, the steady presence who tucked her in at night, who reassured her that everything would be okay. She had no idea that the man she loved was about to be ripped from her life in the most violent and senseless way. It was only when the knock on the door came, heavy, official, that the world she had once known began to crumble. Her mother's face paled as the news sank in. Her father was gone. Her hero was gone. The words felt like they could never be real, like they belonged in some terrible nightmare. But the officers standing at the door, their faces hardened with grim determination, confirmed the horror. Detective James Carter's death wasn't just a loss for his family. It was a loss for the whole community, one that would ripple through every corner of their lives. And while his wife and children struggled to comprehend the incomprehensible, they soon learned the most painful truth. The target on James's back was no accident, and it was just the beginning. The investigation into his murder would reveal not only the extent of the corruption that James had uncovered in his final years as a detective, but also the chilling lengths to which powerful people would go to silence the truth. As his family faced the devastating aftermath, they were left with one haunting question. Who was behind the murder of James Carter, and why had they taken everything from them? In the silence that followed that night, Emily's grief gave way to something else, something she wasn't sure she was ready for, but something that would grow in her as the years passed, a burning desire for justice, for answers. She didn't yet know how she would fight or what it would cost, but she knew one thing for sure. Her father's story was far from over. The aftermath. Back at home, Emily had no idea that her world was unraveling. She was probably finishing her homework, maybe setting the table for dinner, waiting for the sound of her dad's keys jingling at the door. But instead of his familiar footsteps, it was the shrill ring of the phone that shattered the evening's peace. Her mother answered, and Emily watched as all the colour drained from her face. The phone slipped from her trembling hands. "James has been shot," the voice on the other end had said. "It's bad." Emily didn't fully understand what those words meant. Not yet. But in the days that followed, as her father lay in a hospital bed fighting for his life, the reality set in. The man who had spent his life bringing justice to others was now at the center of a crime that no one could explain. The police scrambled for answers. Who had wanted him dead? Was it an old case coming back to haunt him? A criminal seeking revenge? Or something even more sinister? One thing was certain, this was not over. A life forever changed. Detective Carter survived, but the man who woke up in that hospital bed was not the same man who had kissed his daughter goodnight just days before. The scars on his face told only part of the story. The real wounds ran deeper, invisible but impossible to ignore. For Emily, the questions never stopped. Who had done this? Why? And more than anything, what would happen next? And so, I ask you, if someone you loved was nearly taken from you, how far would you go to find the truth? Would you risk everything? even if the answers led you down a dark and dangerous path. A childhood stolen. From that moment on, Emily Carter's childhood was over. There were no more carefree summer nights catching fireflies, no more bike rides through the neighborhood without a second thought. Their home, once a place of warmth, laughter and safety, became a fortress. The front yard, where Emily used to play with her friends, was now patrolled by armed officers. Attack dogs roamed the perimeter, their low growls a constant reminder that danger was never far away. A sniper was stationed on the roof, his silhouette barely visible against the moonlit sky. Cameras watched every entrance, every movement, every shadow. Emily's mother tried to pretend things were normal, but even she couldn't hide the way her hands shook when she locked the doors at night. Triple checking, just to be sure. Fear wasn't just in their home, it was in their bones. Living in the crosshairs, Emily was only 10, but she understood something most kids her age never had to think about. The world was not a safe place. Every time she stepped outside, an officer followed a few paces behind. At school, she wasn't just another kid anymore. She was the detective's daughter. The one whose father had almost been murdered. The one who might still be a target. Whispers followed her down the hallways. Was it a gang? A hitman? Someone with a grudge? The questions haunted her, but no one had answers. The only thing everyone knew for sure was that whoever had come for her father hadn't been caught. And as long as they were still out there, Emily and her family would never be safe. A life on pause. For months, maybe even years, they lived in survival mode. Emily barely recognized the girl staring back at her in the mirror. The laughter that once came so easily was gone. Sleep became a luxury, not a guarantee. She missed her father. Not the man in the hospital bed struggling to form words, but the man who used to tuck her in at night. The man who always smelled like coffee and aftershave. The man who made her feel like nothing bad could ever happen. But bad things had happened, and Emily knew, deep down, that they weren't over. Would life ever return to normal, or had normal been stolen from her forever? And here's the real question. If you were in Emily's shoes, would you ever feel safe again? A ruthless enemy. James Carter had spent his career walking the thin, dangerous line between justice and chaos. He wasn't just a cop. He was the kind of officer who didn't flinch in the face of power, the kind who believed that no one, no matter how rich or connected, was above the law. That belief had earned him respect from his peers and enemies from those who thrived in the shadows. Among them was Vincent Rourke. To the public, Rourke was a successful businessman, sharp suits, expensive cars, a permanent seat at high-end charity galas, but beneath the polished surface he was something much darker. His empire was built on fear. He didn't just make deals, he eliminated obstacles. Arson, bribery, extortion, those were just tools in his belt. And murder? Well, some people whispered that Rourke didn't just order deaths, he made sure they happened. James Carter had never been afraid of men like Rourke, and maybe that was his mistake. A target on his back. The bad blood between them started with an arrest. Not Rourke himself, but his younger brother, a reckless, arrogant man who thought his last name made him untouchable. James had charged him with reckless endangerment, and the case was solid. There was no bribing his way out of it, no backdoor deal that could make it disappear. Rourke had tried, of course. A quiet offer at first. Make this go away, and you'll never have to worry about money again. When James refused, the threats followed. At the time, James had shrugged them off. Threats were part of the job. He had dealt with men like Rourke before. They talked big, flexed their power, but when the law came knocking, they ran like rats. But this time was different, because just weeks after Rourke's brother was locked up, James was ambushed and left for dead. Coincidence or revenge? James had spent his life chasing the truth, but now he was the one lying in a hospital bed, wondering if he'd just been another piece in a much bigger game. The shotgun blast that nearly killed him wasn't random, and deep down he knew it. Not an accident. Those 3 words he had scrawled before blacking out weren't just a warning. They were a message, to himself, to the people investigating his case, to anyone willing to listen. Someone had come for him. And the only question left was, would they come again? If you were James Carter, would you fight back? Or would you run before they finished the job? The untouchable man. Despite overwhelming evidence pointing to Vincent Rourke as the mastermind, the case against him stalled before it could even begin. Witnesses refused to come forward. Leads dried up overnight. Those who might have spoken out suddenly had a change of heart or disappeared altogether. It didn't take long for James Carter's family to understand the bitter truth. Justice wasn't blind, it was bought. The police should have been closing in on Rourke, but instead they avoided his name like a curse. It wasn't incompetence. It was fear. Fear of what might happen to their careers. Fear of what might happen to their families. Fear of what had already happened to James Carter. And as James lay in a hospital bed, his body broken and his mind burning with the need for vengeance, his family found themselves in the middle of a war they never signed up for. A family under siege. While James fought for his life, his family lived in hiding. Every shadow felt like a threat. Every knock on the door sent a jolt of terror through the household. They weren't just grieving, they were surviving. Then came the night everything almost fell apart. It started with a sound outside, the crunch of gravel beneath slow, deliberate footsteps. A man with a rifle moved toward the house, his presence undeniable. His movements weren't rushed. He was careful, calculated, like a predator circling its prey. Inside, panic spread like wildfire. Lisa Reynolds, the babysitter, didn't hesitate. She grabbed the children, pulling them toward the attic, whispering for them to stay silent. Emily Carter clutched her younger brother's hand, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might give them away. From below, the knocking began. Rap, rap, rap! A voice followed, calm, steady, too steady. "This is Officer Daniels. Open the door." Lisa hesitated. Something felt off. Why was he alone? Why wasn't there a patrol car? Why hadn't the security team called ahead? For what felt like an eternity, the knocking continued. Then the sound of tires skidding on pavement. More footsteps. Voices. A second later, the real officers arrived. And that's when they realized the man outside wasn't an intruder. He was one of their own, a cop assigned to protect them. But that moment of confusion, that single heartbeat where doubt crept in, spoke volumes. Fear had become so normal that even the people meant to protect them felt like threats. A broken man, a dangerous mind. Meanwhile, James Carter was barely holding on. The hospital room smelled like antiseptic and stale air, but beneath it all James could still catch the faint scent of blood. His own. His body had survived, but his face was a ruin of scars and stitches, of swelling and pain. He couldn't speak properly. Eating was a battle. Drinking was an ordeal. Every attempt reminded him of what had been taken from him. His wife, Sarah Carter, begged him to fight for their family. But James was already fighting, just not for the reasons she hoped. He didn't want justice. He wanted revenge. Rourke had taken everything from him, and James Carter wanted to return the favor. The thin line between justice and vengeance. James had spent his career upholding the law, but when the law refused to uphold him, what choice did he have? Was it wrong to want revenge? Or, in a world where men like Vincent Rourke thrived, was it the only way to even the score? And if you were in James Carter's shoes, what would you do? Forced to disappear. James Carter had spent his career believing in the system, in law, in order, in justice. But now, as he sat in a dimly lit room, staring at the stacks of paperwork that should have led to an arrest, he realized the truth. Justice wasn't coming. The investigation into his attempted murder had been nothing more than a formality, a show to keep up appearances. Key evidence vanished, witness statements were retracted. The case itself? It had been scrubbed from police records, as if it had never happened. And Vincent Rourke, untouchable, unquestioned, unscathed. James wasn't just a victim of an attack, he was being erased. A family on the run. It became painfully clear the Carters would never be safe in their hometown. Their house, once fortified like a war zone, now felt more like a cage. Every day was a waiting game, waiting for the next attack, the next threat, the next time the phone rang with silence on the other end. So they made the only choice they had left. They ran. Under the cover of night, with nothing but a few bags and a small police escort, they left the only home they had ever known. No goodbyes, no explanations, just an unspoken agreement that they would never look back. The road stretched endlessly ahead, taking them far from the city, far from the life they had once known, deep into the heart of rural Tennessee. There, in a remote town where no one asked questions, they became ghosts of their former selves. New names, new backstories, new lives. Emily and her siblings were forced to play along, to rewrite their history with every conversation. We're just a regular family, that was the rule. No slips, no mistakes. The truth was dangerous, and in their new world, one wrong word could mean the difference between survival and being found. But pretending to be normal and feeling normal were two very different things. The battle for years. James Carter lived with a war raging inside him. He had spent his life taking down men like Rourke. Now, he was the one in hiding, while his enemy walked free. The injustice burned him from the inside out. At night, when the house was silent, he would sit alone with his thoughts, plotting, calculating. Could he go back? Could he do what the system had failed to do? Could he kill Vincent Rourke? He played out the scenario 1,000 times. The drive back to the city, the weapon in his hand. The moment their eyes met, a reckoning long overdue, but every time, something held him back. Maybe it was his wife, Sarah, who had already sacrificed everything just to keep them together. Maybe it was Emily, who still looked at him with something resembling trust despite all she had lost. Maybe it was the realization that if he crossed that line, if he became the very thing he despised, he wouldn't just lose himself. He would lose them. And so, after years of torment, James made his choice. He would never forgive. He would never forget. But he would let go. Because revenge might have given him justice, but it would have cost him everything else. The price of survival. The Carters had escaped, but at what cost? A new home, a new life, a new name, but the past never really disappeared. Could you ever truly move on from something like this? And if you were in James Carter's position, would you have made the same choice? Justice too late, decades passed. Life moved on. By 2003, the world had changed in ways no one could have predicted. Cell phones, the internet, a new millennium, everything felt different. But for James Carter, one thing had remained frozen in time, the night he was nearly murdered. Then, after years of silence, the truth finally surfaced. Vincent Rourke's own brother, the same man James had arrested all those years ago, came forward with a confession. Whether it was guilt, desperation, or simply the weight of time pressing down on him, no one knew. But the words he spoke shattered the last remnants of doubt. Vincent had done it. Not just ordered it, pulled the trigger himself. The brother recounted in chilling detail how Vincent had sat in the back of a car that night, his face hidden behind a ski mask, how he watched James drive past, how he gripped the shotgun in his hands, how he didn't hesitate. The blast that had torn through James's face, that had stolen his old life, had come from Vincent's own hands. After all these years, the truth was finally out. But justice? Justice had never felt further away. The cost of time. The confession should have been the key to everything. It should have led to an arrest, a conviction, a reckoning. But it didn't. Because time had done what corruption couldn't. It had erased any chance of consequences. The statute of limitations had expired. Vincent Rourke, the man who had walked free for decades, who had lived his life untouched while James and his family had lived in fear, could never be prosecuted. The law had no hold over him anymore, but karma did. A fitting end. By the time the confession came, Vincent Rourke was no longer the powerful, untouchable kingpin he once was. The years had done to him what no court, no jury, no prison ever could. He had lost everything: his wealth, his influence, his mind. Dementia had stolen the very thing he valued most: control. Instead of living out his days in luxury, he spent them in a facility, confined to a wheelchair, trapped in a mind that no longer recognized the world around him. Some say he muttered to himself at night, repeating names no one understood. Some say he screamed in the darkness, haunted by ghosts only he could see. James Carter's name was among them. It wasn't the justice James had fought for. It wasn't the closure Emily had hoped for. But maybe, in some way, it was enough. The question that remains: justice delayed is justice denied. But in the end, did Vincent Rourke get what he deserved? And more importantly, would that have been enough for you? A new beginning time has a way of reshaping pain. It doesn't erase it. It doesn't make it disappear. But it softens the edges, turning sharp memories into something easier to carry. For Emily Carter, the past had once been a shadow that followed her everywhere. A name she couldn't say, a story she couldn't tell. But now, decades later, she no longer hides from it. She sits at her desk, fingers gliding over the worn keys of her laptop, weaving together words that once felt too heavy to speak. She is no longer just a survivor. She is a storyteller, an author, a mother. Her children will never know the life she lived, the nights spent in hiding, the whispers of danger that clung to every breath. And that, she realizes, is the greatest victory of all. The measure of a man. James Carter had lost many things in his life: his face, his career, his home. But the one thing they never took from him was his family. And in the end, that was all that mattered. He sits on his porch now, watching the sun dip below the Tennessee hills, the air thick with the scent of pine and earth. The rage that once consumed him has faded, replaced by something unexpected: peace. For years he had believed that justice meant retribution, that peace could only come from settling the score. But he was wrong. He won, not because he got revenge, but because he chose to live. And in that choice, his family found happiness again. The question that remains: some scars never fade, some battles never truly end. But at what point do we stop letting the past define us? And if you were Emily, would you share your story, or leave it buried where it began?